Programming Throwdown, episode 146, RubyShield, RubyCentral and Shopify with Mike Dalessio and Evan Phoenix. Take it away, Jason.
Hey, everybody. So 99 episodes ago, we covered Ruby back in 2015. If any of you kind of heard that episode, you might have been sort of shaking your fist in the car or at the stereo. Patrick and I have done a little bit of Ruby. We did our best to do it justice, but I'm so thankful that here we are, almost 100 episodes later. The podcast has really kind of come a long way. I'm really, it's kind of wild just thinking about it, but we have two amazing folks who know Ruby way better than Patrick and I will probably ever know in our whole lives. So we have Mike Dalessio, engineering director at Shopify, and we have Evan Phoenix, longtime Rubyist, on the show to talk about Ruby, also talk about RubyShield, RubyCentral, how Ruby plays a big role at Shopify and plenty of other companies, and really just dive deep into where the language has gone. So thanks so much, both of you, for coming on the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Cool. So maybe we'll jump in just with a couple of backgrounds. Maybe Mike, you want to go first and tell us sort of what your sort of journey has been like, what your experience with Ruby has been over the years, and what kind of is the journey, the path that took you to Shopify?
Sure. I guess my journey to Ruby starts before I used Ruby. When I started my career, I was working in physics and then later financial services using Fortran and C, which are two of the least user-friendly languages you can imagine. And so by the time I hit like mid-career, mid 2000s at this point, so let's call it 2005, 2006, I started to use Ruby for a couple of hobby projects, and it made sense to me. Like something clicked. Like Ruby is it's very easy to use. And you can tell that one of the principles behind the language from the creator, Mats, is to make developers happy. Like it definitely made me happy, and something clicked in my brain, and it became my primary language for writing like one-off scripts or even for doing bigger projects. I tried as hard as I could to use it for my next full-time job, which I did. And it's kind of been downhill ever since. I even got my start in open source with Ruby as well. I started contributing back upstream, and some very friendly people in the Ruby community were very encouraging. And it was painless. And I said, I guess I'll do this some more. And so now I've been using Ruby for something like 16 years and showing no signs of going back to Fortran at this point.
Nice. So that's a really interesting thing. You fell in love with Ruby, and then you said, I would like to find a career where I can do Ruby. And so my impression is that might be challenging in something like physics. And so you probably have to switch disciplines, right? So what was that like? And it must be a really interesting sort of set of calculus there to say, okay, I really love Ruby. I love physics. I can't really do both of these. I'm going to pick Ruby. And how did that whole thing go?
Well, for me, I had already left financial services where you're expected to use C or C++ or, on a bad day, Fortran. And I was already working at a small startup where I had the opportunity to play around with Python and PHP and Ruby. And like Ruby's kind of what I really like. I really grokked it, and I really understood it well, and it resonated with me. So then my next job was at a small startup with a friend from college, and we had the opportunity to build a new app, essentially for let's call it energy trading. It wasn't really trading, but it was a company that owns some power plants. You need to bid your energy into the market and do some light trading. And I was like, I'm going to write this in Rails, and it's going to be great. And it all came together in about 3 weeks. I had built a replacement for their previous system that looked almost identical. And that was the opportunity for me, was to kind of put a bunch of my skills together and write this new greenfield thing in Ruby at a new job at a startup where we had a lot of flexibility around the tech stack. And I think that was the key bit for me, is Ruby was not a common language in 2007. And so I had to make my own opportunities in a way. We've come a long way since then. I think Ruby is very much enterprisey at this point in time for a lot of companies.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We talked to a gentleman earlier who worked a lot with Dask, and said something similar where they really wanted to use Dask, and they found the only place, at least local to them, was a startup. And so it does seem like startups are a good place to have sort of more greenfield, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? You would think like big companies with zillions of dollars to burn would be the place to go to experiment with new languages. But in practice, you find that they've built all the infrastructure around C, and so everyone's using C. And if you want to use Ruby, you're going to have to fight through like 17 layers of the organization or something.
Yeah, I think that you're right on the money, that it does work that way in large companies. And I think it's economies of scale. I think at some point companies get to a size and scale where they say, listen, exceptions are really expensive to track and take care of and limit the flexibility, right? Like, oh, you want to do this project in Haskell? Fantastic. You're one of 3 people who work for the company that know Haskell. And if you leave, then we're stuck with a Haskell project that nobody understands. We'll have to throw it away and start over. Like there's a lot of risks that big companies just don't want to take on new languages and new frameworks a lot of the time.
Cool. That makes sense. So you're at this energy kind of management or energy trading startup. Did you go from there to Shopify, or was there a string of opportunities in between?
Oh, yeah, there's a bunch of stuff in between. So
Okay.
from that startup, imagine it as I wrote some code for, 6 months to try to get us a beta version that we could build and sell. We were in startup mode, and then I needed to go actually pay my mortgage. So I got like a day job, and I was doing that at night. And my day job was at Pivotal Labs, which back in the day was a well-known agile consultancy that specialized in Ruby and Rails applications at the time. And so I started there, and we worked on this enormous Rails app for a client called Case Commons, doing child welfare management, which is a really, really complex business domain. And Rails helped us focus on like the business logic and not on the incidental complexity of building a large system. And that's when I really got sold on Rails as kind of the easiest and fastest way to get something new up and running. Later became a client at another startup of Pivotal. Then I went back to Pivotal again, where I ran their New York consulting business. And then finally, I worked on Cloud Foundry, which is it's like Heroku for enterprises, right? You want your developers to have that ease of pushing an app, but you have your own data center. Like, what do? You buy Cloud Foundry and you run it internally. And Cloud Foundry, as it turns out, was originally built by VMware in Ruby. Weird coincidence. It was built in Ruby. But it turns out that Ruby is not great at doing things like handling, at least in 2016, it was not good at handling 10,000 simultaneous network connections, the kind of things that you need to run this big platform as a service. And so then we started selectively rewriting pieces in Go. But for the most part, there were big chunks of Cloud Foundry that today are still in Ruby. And so I ran engineering for Cloud Foundry for about 4 years too. And then I came to Shopify finally.
Ah, nice. Very cool. So I'm trying to do the math here. So you joined Shopify 4 or 5 years ago?
It was about 2.5 years ago.
Oh, 2.5 years ago.
2.5
Okay.
years ago, yeah. I was at Pivotal for about 12 years total.
Ah, okay.
Really long
Got it.
time. Really long time.
Yeah, that is awesome. So Pivotal is more like targeting developers, different than so Shopify is more of like a B2C, or I guess it is a B2B, but it has a different sort of customer base. And so was there any shearing effect going from Pivotal to Shopify? What was sort of the biggest differences there?
So definitely the biggest differences were, Cloud Foundry, we were selling to like the Fortune 100 companies, right? We were selling to like huge financial institutions, huge retail institutions. And Shopify is selling a product to a lot of mom and pop store owners, especially during the pandemic. A lot of mom and pop store owners who no longer could open their store and wanted to get online. And Shopify was a really easy way for someone who has inventory and a store and a business model to start selling online. Like that's what Shopify is really all about. It's trying to make, in the same way that like a great language will help a developer focus on the business logic that's important, right? Shopify helps a store owner focus on the business and not on the problems of accounting and how do I get connected to a payment gateway and all. Like, if someone's not a software developer, they don't want to deal with that part of running an online store, and that's what Shopify takes care of.
Got it. That makes sense. So when you joined Shopify, there must be a legacy of Ruby at Shopify for it to really pique your interest.
There is. So Toby Toby is our CEO. He's only got one name. He's like Madonna. Toby, Toby Lutka. He is an old school Rubyist himself, and he, in fact, was one of the early collaborators on the Rails framework, which is the big web framework in the Ruby community. So he started Shopify. He was like the second person ever to use Rails, right? He and David Hansen were friends, and he started using it to build Shopify. And I think he feels very strongly, if you asked him, he would tell you that he feels strongly that Shopify was successful because he was able to move so quickly, right? He was able to get to production faster than his competitors. And there were a couple of instances that we have an internal podcast at Shopify where he talks about this. And he said there were a couple of occasions where Shopify was like close to going out of business. And the fact that he was able to ship new features and get new customers in a matter of weeks made a real fundamental difference in whether Shopify was going to make it through those tough times. And since then we've of course IPO'd, and now we're a multi-billion-dollar company. So it's all in the past. But I think he credits Ruby and Rails with a lot of Shopify's success. And so we have a very strong opinion internally that that's the default stack we use.
Cool. That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, I have not a counterexample, but a correlated example where we were trying to build a while ago at another company. We were trying to build a new product, a new area for the company. And because so much was done in Java, they said, we'll write the whole thing in Java. And I actually, and this is a bit of my personal, anecdotal opinion here, take it with a grain of salt, but I feel like Java really caused the product to slow down, the product development. And part of it wasn't just that it was in Java, but it was also that it was hooked into all these other systems that were written in all sorts of different languages. And so they all had different APIs. And, oh, there isn't a Java API for this backend. So now we're all just sitting on our hands. And I think that's one of the reasons why that project just couldn't get off the ground, was that it couldn't move fast enough. So we'll definitely talk about, you mentioned several times agility with Ruby and Rails. We'll definitely cover that, but we'll put a bookmark in it for now. And switch gears and talk to Evan. Evan, why don't you tell us what your background is and what your sort of connection is with Ruby?
Sure. So my story starts in the first tech bubble, the bursting of the first tech bubble. So I graduated from college in 2002, which was the uniformly known as the worst possible time to get a programming job. Every single place was firing, no place was hiring.
I remember at that same time I was in undergrad. I graduated a little bit after you in 2004, and I remember my dad basically shaking his head saying, "I told you, you should have got a math degree. You went and got a CS degree. Look at you now."
I mean, you were right in the end, but at that time it was tough. So it was 2002. I had just graduated. I moved to Seattle. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I moved to Seattle. She was starting her master's program, and I'm not a great student. I had no interest in continuing on with higher education. So I was like, I'm just going to figure it out. And so I tried to get a job, couldn't get a job. Ended up getting a job with a local ISP. It was a 3-person ISP, and I basically put 802.11, not B. So pre-B standard 802.11 dishes on people's roofs for this ISP because it was a wireless ISP. And so I would spend afternoons on roofs, retirement buildings on roofs, lots of roofs. I've seen so many the roofs of Seattle. I should have started a scrapbook in retrospect. So many roofs. So I'm at this job and I don't want to be I wanted to be a programmer. That was what I had done. I'd actually done open source in college. I had worked on some programming language stuff in college because it was really interesting to me, but now I didn't have any opportunity for that. But when I moved to Seattle, I was very active in a specific IRC channel from college. And one of the people in the IRC channel actually was like, "Hey, I'm writing this really interesting thing." And I found he was also in Seattle, coincidentally, this guy, even though we'd been talking for years. And he was like, "Hey, I'm writing this thing, and it's in this programming language called Ruby." And I was like, I'd never heard of that. And so I went to go look at it, and it took me about a couple of weeks before I was like, because I had done Perl and PHP almost exclusive, and C++ and C at that point in time. But on the sort of Ruby-ish side of things, PHP and Perl. And so it took me a while to get the feel for Ruby. But once I did, I was like, oh, this is great. I like this a lot better than the stuff that I've been doing before. It's easy to express what I want. I'm not fighting with Perl sigils, which is the little symbol you put at the beginning all the time. Like I liked it a lot. I ended up getting involved with Ruby and then not seeing that RubyConf, which was like the Ruby conference that started in 2000. I actually missed it by a week. It was in Seattle. It was down the block from me. Didn't go because didn't realize. Like I literally was just like, oh yeah, Ruby, that's a cool thing. Oh, the conference was here last week. It was pretty amusing. But I did get involved with some other Ruby people in Seattle, Ryan Davis and Eric Hodel, and we started the first. It's hard to say if it's the first, but effectively people usually call it the first Ruby user group, Seattle RB. And it was just the three of us. We used to meet at Ryan's work and just putz around and do random talk about things. We ended up getting, like I remember one time we got a review copy of the pickaxe book, which is like the original reference book for Ruby that Dave Thomas wrote. And we did a review of that to set Dave notes because I think Ryan knew him at the time. And anyway, so that's how it started.
So you're working for this ISP. You're mounting Wi-Fi dishes on roofs, but you were involved in a lot of these kind of social groups and sort of building up this Ruby ecosystem. And that's actually a testament. I think there's so many companies talking about this looming recession. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody really does. But something to sort of foreshadow or some foresight based on your experience is to, even if the job market does contract to get difficult, there's always so much that you can do, as an individual. There's so many, different conventions you can go to, people you can meet, and that is going to be more and more important as we sort of, go through this like kind of small lull here.
Yeah, I mean, recessions affect the economies of monetary policy, not people's enthusiasm or interest, right?
So, right. Yeah.
At the time, it was impossible to get a Ruby job. Well, at the time, Ruby jobs did not exist. It was not a thing. Mats had only begun Ruby in 1996, and it only lived on his laptop for the first couple of years anyway. And so we're talking 2002-ish timeframe, maybe 2003 a little bit now. And Dave Thomas, the guy who wrote the pickaxe book, is kind of credited with bringing Ruby to the English-speaking world. Mats is Japanese. Dave has a great story. I can't remember the exact details, so I'll probably butcher it. But effectively, he saw Ruby. He saw some of the original documentation. He was getting into technical book publishing, and he wrote the first English version of the pickaxe book. We call it the pickaxe book because it has a pickaxe on the cover. And so he wrote the original version of that basically was it was the only guide to Ruby that wasn't written in Japanese. And I think, so I'll fast forward a little bit. I ended up stumbling into another job accidentally, working as the Windows IT administrator, which was better than putting dishes on roofs. So I went to go do that. And then but I still wanted to be programming. And so I started it was a startup in Seattle. I started attending all the engineering meetings. They had a meeting where they were like, hey, like we want to redo the back end for this thing because it's not working very well. It's really cobbled together. We want to actually use basically it was like sort of a Linux system administration / programming project. And I was like, I am very interested in this. If no one else has, I've actually done this before because I'd done it in college. I'm happy to take this on. And they're like, sure. I was still the Windows IT admin. And so I was doing the Windows IT administration, keeping the mail server up, making sure people could log in, and writing this new backend. And when I was writing this new backend, I was like, this is sort of what you're talking about earlier. Nobody was telling me anything. They're just get it done. We just need a thing. And I was like, great. I'm going to write it in Ruby because that was way more interesting than writing it in anything else at the time. So I started writing it in Ruby. I wrote this amazing gateway so that PHP could call Ruby methods on the same machine because all the front end people were writing PHP. It was an insane system.
PHP Ruby interop.
Yeah, it's somewhere out there on the. I might not be on the internet even. Anyway, so I worked there for a while. Ended up leaving a couple of years. Oh, like that they got built up. We ended up doing a lot of Ruby at that company. I ended up leaving and then going to another small startup for about 6 months, basically writing a Rails app. And then in 2006, that was in 2000. That was like the beginning of 2006. So in 2007, I was still living in Seattle. I was going to move down to LA. I ended up going to RailsConf that year. This is another sort of diatribe. We'll keep it short, which is I have weird programming interests. I had been writing a new version of Ruby, the programming language, the interpreter. So Ruby, as any kind of dynamic language, is just a program that reads other programs and runs them, right?
Mhm.
It's like a chef that's running a recipe, but the program is the chef. And so I had all these interests in how to make Ruby better. And I had started writing my own version of the actual interpreter, the engine to run
Wow.
Ruby programs. And I had been doing that for a year and a half, 2 years at that point. And I had a thing that was interesting. I ended up giving a little talk about it at RailsConf, which is in Portland that year. I drove down from Seattle to Portland to talk about it. And the CTO of Engine Yard, which was a early Rails hosting company, saw my talk and he's like, I think your thing's cool. Tom Bernini is his name, his CTO. I think your thing is really cool. Would you be interested in coming and working for Engine Yard, and we'll let you work on this thing? And I was like, this
Oh,
is the
that's
dream.
amazing.
This is the dream, right?
Yeah.
Like someone wants to pay me to work on my open source project. So I said yes as fast as I could. And then I did that for 5 years. I just worked on my own, an open source Ruby implementation for about 5 years. It's called Rubinius. And yeah, that was super intense. There's lots of stories about that.
Where did Rubinius go? Like, did parts of it get folded into Ruby, or are folks still using it?
Well, it had a lot of contributions. I would say that a big portion of the stuff that we wrote, it lives out on the internet, but is probably not in heavy usage. Probably there's a couple of people who still use it for random things. What ended up happening was I started writing Rubinius when Ruby was at version 1.8.2. That was in 2006. And at that time, Ruby was actually moving pretty slowly in terms of the API, the functionality, all that kind of stuff. And so it made it easy if I was like somebody's trying to come in and being like, I want to implement this API, which is just the programming language's API. And it was, about a year after that or so that the Mats and the Ruby core team really started to speed things up. And it only got faster and faster over the next couple of years. And it's hard. It's very hard to write a thing that's chasing something else and you don't have any control over it. You're just chasing this other thing. And after about 5 years of working on it, I was personally like, I want to be more in control of my own destiny. Like every day I was coming in and being like, what crazy weird API do I have to implement today that I don't want to? And that's not fun as a job. I ended up leaving there and going to Living Social. But yeah, that was that bit.
Oh, interesting.
I think there's one other thing I want to throw in here while we're talking about Rubinius. Like if you look at Ruby on like, I don't know, like decades long time scale, one of the, I think, most important outcomes from the Rubinius project was actually RubySpec, which is like the specification for Ruby. It was an executable, it was tests, right? They were an executable specification for Ruby because the original Ruby interpreter, it was just like, well, it behaves how it behaves. Like it's the only Ruby interpreter. And so there were a lot of edge cases that were kind of undefined behavior. And as part of the Rubinius project, that RubySpec project is actually still alive and kicking today and unifies all of the Ruby interpretations because there's like JRuby, which is built on the JVM, and there's Truffle Ruby, which is built on GraalVM, as well as Ruby and Rubinius and a few others that are all using RubySpec as the de facto standard for the Ruby language now. I think that is a really important outcome as well.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think the parallel that comes to my mind is io.js, right? So Node had some deficiencies. So I think it was maybe the original Node author. I don't actually remember the I might be getting that wrong, but somebody wrote EO, and long story short, EO and Node merged later on, and so a lot of the best parts of EO made it into Node. And so I think, yeah, it sounds like something similar to that happened here, where as a consequence of Rubinius, you have this specification for the language, and that created huge harmony among all these different interpreters and pushed the language forward.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things, the Ruby community it's a byproduct of there's a saying in the Ruby community called MINASWAN, which is Maths is nice, so we are nice, and that there's a big
Nice.
there's a big it seems like a thing that people wouldn't actually say, but people mention it all the time. It's really part of the ethos of the Ruby community. The Ruby community has like spread its wings as it's gotten bigger in time. And I think one of the most interesting things is that this is my skewed perception, but my perception is that the Ruby community is one of the first communities that really took TDD, test-driven development, to heart. It existed mostly from Kent Beck in the Smalltalk world, but there isn't that many Smalltalk developers. And a lot of those Smalltalk developers ended up in Ruby or were influenced into Ruby at various times. And like, I remember being exposed to TDD in like 2002, 2003, when nobody was doing it. And that was a big impact on Rubinius writing Ruby spec. Brian Shirai, who was the second or third person to work on Rubinius with me, started that specifically because it was like, hey, we got to know what we're doing. We got to write some tests. We got to write specification for this thing. And still to this day has a huge impact. So it's Ruby spec ended up being adopted into the mainline Ruby interpreter, that they still write those specs. One of the big things about Rubinius was I tried to write all of, or as much of, the Ruby API in Ruby itself, right? So you could go and like look at the implementation of array and it would be written in Ruby, for instance. That code made its way over to Truffle Ruby, which is a very specialized implementation of Ruby, and has evolved since then. They've edited it. They're perfectly much more owned by them at this point, but it's kind of seeded itself in different ways.
Very cool. So after Rubinius, at that point, what's the sort of link between that and Ruby Gems, which is what your focus is on now? What's the path there?
Yeah. So I started going to Ruby conferences in 2005, which was in San Diego. I got to watch the first release of Rails be released. They released it at RubyConf, which is just Toby and David in the front of the room releasing it. It was very interesting. So I ended up starting going to Ruby conferences then, and they were great. I was in the community. I was super interested in it, and I kind of just kept going. As my second job or whatever in this story showed, like I fall into system administration jobs fairly regularly. Tasks maybe is probably the right rather than actual jobs. And in 2011, there was a thing called RubyForge, which was a hosting platform that was meant to, this is pre-GitHub, so it started pre-GitHub. It was basically a place for people to store their Ruby code, right? That was really what it was for. And it was sort of an alternative to SourceForge, which some of your audience has heard of and some of your audience has not. It was a sort of a precursor for where to store your code on the internet.
Yeah, SourceForge, if you've ever needed an old library and you end up clicking on 14 ads and you don't actually get the zip file of the library, that was SourceForge.
That was SourceForge, yeah. Oh man, there's like you could do a 3-hour thing about the evolution of SourceForge as well. So there was RubyForge, which really just ran. There was a package called GForge, which was just like you could run your own SourceForge-like thing. And so there was a couple of Ruby developers ran a thing called RubyForge. It's just rubyforge.org. People would upload their things. And then in 2007 or so, I'd have to go back and check if it was 2006, 7, or 8. I can't remember. A couple of Ruby developers, Chad Fowler and David Black, who were all directors at RubyCentral, which is the nonprofit that puts on the conference, start basically at a conference. We're like, we need our own like Java jar-like thing. So let's write one. And so they basically wrote Ruby Gems. The first version was a couple of weeks, probably the first version was probably at the conference. So within a couple of days. And then they wired in the ability to handle Ruby Gems inside RubyForge. So if you uploaded a gem file to RubyForge, it would be available for you to do gem install. That was the first version of Ruby Gems. So fast forward again back to 2011, I got wind that they were still running RubyForge. Well, I knew they were still running RubyForge, and that there was only one person who was this administrator for this whole system. And I was like, that's not cool. That's not fair. And I was like, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to say, like, I'm happy to help you out run this thing. And so I reached out just to say, like, do you need another hand, another person who can basically help be on call? Because the guy who was running it is a wonderful guy, but it was not fair to him to basically be doing this whole thing. So that's how I got involved with Ruby Gems originally. It was basically, I'm going to help out run, well, a little bit. I got involved with Ruby Gems software a little bit earlier than that, but the bulk of it was really the stuff we're talking about today is really helping out run the server, debug some crazy things, and then that was how it began.
So what is it like going to a language conference? So let's say you're a college student, you really love, I'm just going to pick a language. You really love Ruby. Maybe you've made a few commits to the sort of core, Ruby interpreter or other parts of the ecosystem, but you just love programming in Ruby. What would someone like that get out of a conference? How would you recommend getting the most out of a conference if it's your first time? What's that whole thing like? I've been to a lot of conferences, but admittedly, I've never been to a programming language conference. It's on my bucket list. But kind of describe to us all what that is like and what you would expect to see there, and how to really have an effective time there.
Let me take a whack at answering this real quick. So my strong opinion here is that there's a spectrum of conferences, and there's like some conferences are small. Like I used to co-organize the Gotham Ruby conference in New York City, which was 1 day, 1 track, very intimate conference. So everyone had the same shared experience. You show up, you sit next to somebody, you get to know them, you go to lunch, you come back, there were some more talks, then we'd go on a boat and have dinner. And it was great. And I think that for me was my introduction to software, language conference. It helps you build a local network of people. And there's usually a really great mix of introductory talks as well as some more advanced talks. And then I think once you get comfortable and you go to 1 or 2 of those, then like maybe you want to say, okay, I'm going to get on a plane and I'm going to go to a bigger conference. And maybe I go to like a 3-day Ruby conference in New Orleans, which was like my big experience at my first big, huge software conference. And like that's like a really big deal. And then the social network that you've built locally can help you there. But again, there's usually a great mix of both introductory and more advanced talks at all of these conferences. So you can kind of pick and choose which ones you're interested in and want to pay attention to, and you get to talk to the speakers afterwards. And it's as much about the social network you're building as it is about what you're learning inside any individual talk. For me, I don't know, Evan, what's your experience been?
Yeah, I background, I didn't give this at the beginning, but like I helped run RubyConf and RailsConf for about 10 years. And so I have like, there's 3 different styles of programming language event, we call it that. The first, like Mike was talking about, it is a seminar. That's really the way to think about it, right? Which is basically, you're going to show up, you're going to all sit in the same room, you're going to all watch the same talks. You're going to find out about interesting things that you didn't know that you were interested in, and maybe they're going to be over your head, but then you're going to go sit with people at lunch and you're going to say, can you explain this to me a little bit more? Because it seems interesting and I don't really get it. And you're going to have some nice person's going to say like, I'd be happy to. You explain it to them. Now you're friends. Now when you get on the boat later on, maybe you meet their friends, and that's a seminar in general, right? It doesn't even have to be programming language specific. That's how all seminars generally work, which is that everybody sees the same thing, everybody talks about the same things, and then you all sort of bond over that and you learn, right? So when you go home, you go like, I found out about testing. I found out about asynchronous programming, whatever it is. And you want to take that back with you and kind of let that percolate, figure out where it's going to come out in your day-to-day job. Second one is programming language conference, like just regular conference, which is like multi-track conference. RubyConf is an example of this. You have a lot of different, you have like 3 or 4 talks going on at the same time. You have to pick what you're going to go to. There's lunch, there's a keynote talk, there's that kind of thing. It's definitely a little more overwhelming. People have to figure out what do I go to, right? And people would always ask me that at those conferences. And I would say, like, just if you don't know what to go to, just walk into a room, just wander into one of those rooms and sit down in the back and be like, what are we talking about? Right? those are some of the best experiences you're going to have. Is if you never knew what you were looking for until you sat in the back of the room and you found somebody talking about Ruby reflection or something like that. So that's number 2. Number 3 is sort of trade show. RailsConf kind of fits into this one, which is more like a trade show, which is really where you have an actual exhibit floor. You have exhibitors. You have people who are going to show you interesting things. You have sponsors. You still have talks as well. Trade shows always have like continuing education, but there are a lot of places where people are looking for jobs. People are showing off their companies. People are networking. That is more of a trade show, and they all have their place. They're all sort of on the level of overwhelming. Those are ratcheting up the overwhelmingness on that thing. But yeah, there's sort of those 3. Those are the 3 kind of blends. So
cool. That makes sense. Yeah.
If any of your listeners are worried about whether the conference is right for them, like I would say, if you think it's for you, it is for you. And you'll be surprised when you show up and there are 200 other people that have common interests that you can chat to about. So even if you're introverted or you're shy or you're not really sure like what you're going to talk about, generally folks are going to turn up because they're interested in the same things as you. And it's usually a very welcoming experience, I found.
Yeah, definitely. You'd be surprised too if you might be sitting at home very introverted, but if you have a topic that's really passionate to you, you'd be amazed at how quickly you will become an extrovert when you're surrounded by other people who have the same interests. Like, I saw this joke the other day where someone said when they have trouble with their CS homework, they ask a question on Stack Overflow, and then they have a second account, a dummy account, where they give the wrong answer. And then that's what they need to do to get like hundreds of right answers. Yeah. so it's there's so many things where when you dive into the details, there's it comes from there's sort of differing opinions and not really any right answer. And so you're going to come with your opinion that you've calcified, you've spent a lot of time and energy on. You're going to find someone with a totally different opinion, and the two of you are going to have a really engaging discussion. And at the end of it, you probably get to a place of even better balance than when you started. So yeah, that was one thing I found. I was pretty, introverted when I was going to a bunch of machine learning conferences, but I found when I was at the conference, then it was like, oh yeah, I really want to explain this thing, and here's my take on it, and all of a sudden, like all these words start coming out.
I wanted to say one thing, which is that I want to highlight what effectively, I don't know what other people call it, but we call it the hallway track, which is the thing that happens when you're not in the sessions, but is during the conference time. So it's not at lunch or whatever, right? Because at Ruby conferences, at least, the hallway track is just as valuable as any other time that you will be there. Mike and I think our first time meeting was in Orlando, outside the ballroom, where we basically this is RubyConf 2006, I want to say, and it was in Orlando. It was in a hotel where we couldn't leave. Basically, it was like in kind of nowheresville in Orlando, and so we're all sort of sequestered in this hotel. But it was a nice hotel. And the hallway track was amazing because there was like these U-shaped couches where there would end up being like 12 people sitting in a U-shape, one of these U-shapes, some on the floor, some on the couches, working on things. I don't know if you're working on Nokogiri or Apricot at that point in time, and then, yeah, we would talk. Like, I remember debugging libxml issues with you and Aaron at that point in time. Like, does anybody know how this thing works? And someone would be like, oh, I've dealt with that before. And you kind of just do that dance, right? And then you find that like, oh, I didn't realize that other people were also interested in this or whatever, right?
Something else I want to call out, Evan. I mean, I don't know if you have these numbers handy, but at every RailsConf or RubyConf I've been to, during the initial keynote, you ask, for how many people is this your first RubyConf? And like half the room raises their hand usually, right?
Yeah, so it's always half the room. Crazy as that may be, it's always half the room. I mean, I'm up on stage when I ask this question, so my perspective is a little skewed, but it's the most interesting thing that it's half the room. And I think for the audience who are listening to this and thinking like, is Rails something that I like? Are there people still picking it up? Is it a thing? It's very much still a thing, and there are so many people who are just learning Rails for the first time every single year. It's learned in boot camps. It's done in all kinds of different places at small scale, at large scale. And the fact that it's 50% at RailsConf is so important to me, because what it says is that the community is always changing. It's always vibrant. It's not the same 500 people who show up every single year to talk about the same thing they did last year. We talk about that when we would work on the programming for the scheduling for what talks we're going to have. We always think, should we have this talk again? And I have to remind people, 50% of this conference will be brand new. So you could have the same talk every single year, and 50% of people would never have heard it before.
Yeah, that's wild. So so you were helping the support on this. I think it was a Ruby project, and was that RubyCentral, or is RubyCentral something in the future?
Yeah, so RubyCentral is an actual nonprofit set up in the
Okay.
United States that maintains. It was set up originally actually to run the conference, to run RubyConf. They needed an entity that could basically take the insurance load, if you will, of running a conference, and that was how it started. And then after I started helping out with RubyForge and RubyGems.org, I was asked by the then directors of RubyCentral if I wanted to be on the board, if I wanted to help out with RubyCentral at that point. And I was like, yeah, I do, because I want to make sure that stuff actually happens. So I started helping out with RubyGems.org as a board member, and then started helping out with the conferences. We almost tanked the whole thing at RailsConf 2012. That's a longer story than this podcast is available for, but I'm happy to tell it at some future junction. It's great. It has to deal with eating pot pies for 3 days. It's great. It's a great story. But yeah, so I started getting involved then, and RubyCentral is the entity. So RubyCentral exists. There's directors. They have staff now. They didn't have staff back then, which is why we almost tanked it. But there's staff, and it basically maintains and organizes the RubyConf, and RailsConf is an entity that can just basically, all it exists to do is improve the Ruby language and the community. And so it is the entity that pays for RubyGems.org. It pays all those bills. It manages all of the things related to that. So it sort of is the owner of a lot of community resource. So
Yeah, okay. So there's I went to SciPyCon this year, which is, I guess, the closest thing I've been to a language conference. But it was an entity, and I'm totally drawing a blank on the entity that runs it. But I had a chance to talk to some of the directors, and it was wild. I mean, basically, that same entity also make sure that NumPy, SciPy, Dask, all these core languages have sort of a healthy ecosystem. One thing a lot of people take for granted is, if you file, if you get, the equivalent of like internal compiler error or internal interpreter error in Ruby, and you file an issue on GitHub, someone has to be there to catch that, and so that's a huge amount of time and effort for any language. A lot of these consortiums exist to make sure that there isn't sort of a tragedy of the commons where everyone is kind of taking, but there isn't really somebody who can contribute and contribute in a really organized, focused way.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say about RubyCentral as well, because I think that this has been a misunderstanding over the years. It's fine because we didn't correct it. RubyCentral doesn't really make money. Like it's a nonprofit. It exists basically to just put money back into the community. So like when we run a conference, it's really just to pay the bills for RubyGems.org, right? Like, so we always tell people, how can I contribute to RubyGems.org? I said, go to one of the conferences, buy a ticket, right? Like there isn't, prior to 2012 in RailsConf was actually run by O'Reilly, the book publisher. And that was run O'Reilly ran it as a for-profit entity, right? Because that was what they were in. That's why they run conferences is for profit. When RubyCentral took it over, we continued to run it, but we were like, hey, now we can tell you where this money goes. It's for you. We basically take in the money, but we basically give it back to you in the form of these community resources. So there's not some big corporate entity where they're just taking in profits to buy jets or something like that. It literally just goes in there to basically be pumped back out into the community.
Yeah, totally. That makes sense. So cool. Yeah, this would be a good time maybe to talk about Ruby at a high level. My first interaction with Ruby was through this software called Jekyll, where you could spin up a static website, which I needed for a GitHub project. And the thing that I was really impressed with Ruby and Rails was how easy it was to switch databases and things like that. So I had a development version which was using a SQLite database, and then I had a production version that was using some type of hosted. I think it was like a hosted MySQL database, and all of that back in when I was writing data web services in Python, I would have to build all of that from scratch. I would have to say, okay, check some environment variable. If it's this, then use the development database. And I don't have the or I don't have the MySQL library, so I have to go pull that in. It was a lot of manual effort. With Ruby on Rails, you kind of get all of that for free. That was the thing that I really noticed. So yeah, maybe with your kind of expertise, what kind of separates Ruby on Rails from what kind of makes it distinct?
So I like to think about Rails as being like really well vertically integrated pieces of software, right? Like you can come at building a website from like, oh, I'll pick my own like artisanal database adapter, and then I'll figure out how to render views. Then I'll figure, and what Rails did and continues to do is put together like pretty strong opinions. This is how you want to interact with the database. This is how you want to render your views. This is how you do your controller. This is how you do all of your models, and this is how you unit test all of your models. And those conventions are actually really, really liberating, I think, for as a developer. Like I like not having to think about the small details, like, well, what directory do I stick this file in when I do the thing? Like you just say, I need a new model, and all of these things like self-inflate for you. And I feel like over the years, other web frameworks have borrowed a lot of those same like strong conventions and opinions, like Django. If you're writing an app in Django, I think Django is borrowed a lot of stuff from Rails over the years. So for me at least, again, like if you're going for, I want to get something up and running on the internet as quickly as possible, that's going to set me up to continue to add new functionality and continue at this really high velocity over time. Like Rails really sets you up as a software developer to do all of that from day one out of the box. And if you want to color outside the lines a little bit, Rails does allow you to you go ahead and configure it however you want. And there are a lot of like really interesting plugins and alternatives for parts of Rails. But for the most part, I think vanilla Rails is a great way to run a business. Like this is what Shopify does. And part of what my team does is make sure that Shopify is running as vanilla a flavor of Rails as we possibly can. And if we need something special, we try to push that back upstream into open source so that everybody can benefit. And I think if you look at other companies like GitHub and Airbnb, they've made contributions back upstream to Rails over the years as well to make it a better framework. And now I'm going to like grind my open source axe for you a little bit and just be like, this is what makes open source so wonderful, is that these companies that are using the software in anger to do something real are all motivated to contribute back to keep that flywheel going of making the software great and attracting new developers to the community.
Yeah, I think DHH, David Hansen, the originator of Rails, he said it a couple of times, I'll paraphrase, which is basically that having constraints helps you be more creative. And that philosophy also is true in like just how you set up your stack, right? So like having all those opinions also means that there's more constraints. Like, oh, I have to use this. I have to do this. I have to use this one piece. Now, yes, that basically means that like, if I don't want to use it that way, maybe that's annoying. But the flip side about having those constraints and assuming that they're going to be there is that all of those things work really well in concert together. And they allow you to basically say like, okay, maybe I didn't want to spend, most people don't want to spend, months trying to just figure out how to write the best SQL query. Great. You don't have to do that. You can use Active Record, and that as a part of the stack adds constraint, but it also adds an incredible amount of commonality, so that, as a lot of developers will know, when you move from one project to another, so you move between companies, right? You move between companies and they're both writing web apps, means almost nothing about the idea that you will be able to pick up the new company's app, right? They could be in a different language. It could be, even if they're both JavaScript, they could be completely different, like off the wall different, right? If you move between two companies and both of them say, hey, we're both writing Rails, you'll probably be productive on your first day at the new company. You probably go in and be like, okay, did you do this? Did you make this decision or this decision? Oh, you made this one? Cool, got it. And then you're often off to the races, right? And that has such power in being able to have people, be productive, fulfill what they need, and also like be expressive at the same time.
I love the talk about sort of the opinionated framework and being able to build something that lasts. I think it's just such a important piece, and it's also a trap. I'll give kind of a quick tale of two developers. I have two buddies in college. The three of us were eating pizza and talking about video games, and the two of them both wanted to become video game developers. And I was just sitting there eating pizza. It's not my thing. But one of them said, I want to use Unity because even back in, I guess it was like 2005, Unity was around and it was, an easy way to get started. And the other one was saying, no, I can't do this and this and this in Unity. And I can't do all these really specific things. I think we should write everything from scratch, like build our own game engine, our own everything. And I actually don't know what happened to that second guy. So I don't know. Maybe he made his own game engine. I don't know. But the first one actually started a indie game studio and did really well. And so I think this trap that we fall into as creative people is we want to have the most creative medium, right? And the most creative medium is arguably like, I don't know, assembly or something, right? Where you can do absolutely everything. But the problem is that actually when you're getting started is when you need to be as least creative as possible with the particular paradigm you're working on. So, if you've never built a website before, you should focus on having, a nice end product and being able to be creative there by iterating quickly and not spend a lot of time saying, oh, how am I going to, like, what if I need to use this really esoteric graph database, right? So don't worry about that stuff. Just get the thing up and running. And the opinionated thing, whether you're talking about Next or whether you're talking about Rails, it's going to put really polished ivory handcuffs on you. And in the beginning, you're going to say, oh, I'm getting all these weird errors. And, oh, it's not letting me, put everything in the same folder, all the source code in the same folder. Because at least for Next, the directory structure determines the API. So like you find all these roadblocks, but then once you've figured out how to make your thing fit in that paradigm, all of a sudden you get all of these benefits that were outside of your conscious coherence. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, like now I see how, if I wanted to add a piece, I can do that without breaking everything else, right? So yeah, I think this is a trap I've personally fallen into a lot as well, where I say, oh, this piece of software doesn't easily let me do X, so I'm going to write my own thing. And then sure enough, your own thing never actually gets done. So
I was just going to say, I have been through this many times, and I like the way that I like to think of programming specifically is it's an artistic tradecraft, right? Like you can, just like plumbing, you can pick up programming. You can start doing it. You can learn how to learn from other people. You can read a book. You can just, ask somebody. You can be an apprentice. You can do all those things, and you can be the best programmer in the world. That by definition makes it a tradecraft. But so is watercolor painting. Watercolor painting is also a tradecraft. You just sit down and you start watercolor painting. You read a book, you look at it, how somebody did it, you just start doing it, right? Programming is somewhere between plumbing and watercolor, right? And one of the most interesting things about, say, watercolor is that when you decide to do that, it is so constricting. You're like, oh my gosh, I can only make colors like this. I've only got these kinds of paints. It only works on this kind of paper, right? But think of the artistic creativity that's come out of just doing watercolors, right? The world over, right? That constraint breeds creativity in other ways that are potentially much more interesting than just being like, oh, well, I need to express myself. And so I need to spend 2 years making my own paper. Great. Maybe you will achieve something great, but more likely, if you sat down and just learned how to watercolor on normal paint for 2 years, you'd be able to express yourself potentially better than saying, I need the best paper in the world.
Thank you for saying that, Evan. I agree 100%. There's a wonderful article, a blog post from like 2015 by Dan McKinley, who, if your listeners Google for choose boring technology, you will find this essay. And he introduces this really interesting concept of innovation tokens. Like if you're building a thing, you should say, okay, I have 2 tokens that I can use for some innovative technology, and everything else I do has to be boring. And this forces you to make the choice about where do you want to take that risk? Where do you want to spend that time to, rewrite a gaming engine or go grind your own watercolor paint color or make your own paper and think about what is the core competency that you're going for. Like if you you want to start a new gaming company that's predicated on faster frame rates, maybe you want to go build your own gaming engine. Yes. But if you want to build a gaming company built around like super fun stuff, maybe the gaming engine is a distraction and you should use something that's standard off the shelf and put your time and effort into making that game super fun. And I think about web development the same way. Like I could write my own like socket handler from scratch, or I could just use like a load balancer off the shelf and just, there's a ton of trade-offs that you can make along the way, and people should feel free to make those trade-offs, but like choose boring where you don't actually need a competitive advantage is how I would think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's actually a paradox, right? Because if you can make something fit, I'm thinking about the watercolor example. You see examples where people take a style that's very difficult to express in watercolor and or in any other medium, and they make it happen, and people really appreciate that. It's sort of like when you see these pixel art, gigantic landscapes and pixel art and all of that. And so that could be sort of part of the challenge. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to write everything from scratch, and that way I could be as creative as possible, say, I'm going to make this work in this framework. And that actually is going to force me to be as creative as possible. Ostensibly, there's Ruby is a language, Rails is a set of frameworks, but like where is sort of the gap there? Where what other things is Ruby used for? Other than Rails, like what kind of captures a lot of the Ruby market share, and how do we sort of differentiate these two things for people?
Yeah, I think if were having this conversation 6 years ago, I would probably say DevOps was also in that group, right? So famously, Puppet and Chef are both written in Ruby.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so if you go to write Chef cookbooks, you write Ruby. If you go write Puppet thingamabobs, I can't remember what the noun is for Puppet.
Plans, I don't know.
Yeah, you go to write Puppet Pinocchios, then you actually write them in Puppet's specific DSL, but that DSL is actually parsed in Ruby. So if you wanted to extend Puppet, do different things, you actually write Ruby on the back end. So that was big. Those things were born out of this time, this interesting time in the programming community, the zeitgeist of Ruby circa 2010, 2009, around that time, where people were like, hey, let's write everything in Ruby. And so that was, and DevOps was coming up, and cloud was getting big, and we hadn't really hit containers yet. And that was really the era of those tools. Those tools still exist. People still use them every day. I would say that they're probably on the downslope a little bit right now, because cloud and containerization have given people different ways of solving the problems that those same things solved. And so you don't see them as used as much anymore. I think Rails is still the 800-pound gorilla in the Ruby community. I think there are other people you can write. I mean, it's Turing complete. You can certainly write other programs in it. People write all kinds of other services, non-Rails web services, internal services, all kinds of stuff like that in Ruby as well. But I think that service-based applications, be it web or otherwise, are probably the lion's share of what we see in Ruby today. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a healthy number of people who are pushing Ruby towards being a better platform for like big data analysis, right? Like there was the big Ruby conference in Japan happened last week, Ruby Kaigi. there's been a series of talks over the last few years about like how to integrate Ruby with Apache Arrow and how to get like low latency data access and how to do OLTP and OLAP. And I think that's really, really interesting because I think Python has been like the dominating language for a lot of that. And there's no reason Ruby can't be equivalent, except that like we don't have a lot of the same libraries that the Python community has invested in over the years. And so I do see, some hints there of like, well, what are the interesting things that Ruby hasn't traditionally been used for, like big data, and pushing in that direction, which I really like.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was a big effort, Swift Torch. It was this effort to do tensor processing in Swift. And that, I think it was Google actually was pushing that, even though Swift is an Apple thing. I think Google is really pushing this like Swift TensorFlow and Swift Torch. I don't know what happened to that, but I think there is a space for other languages to be in that domain. I think there's a lot of times you need to do tensor processing, no matter where you are. So imagine if you are trying to do some analytics on within your web service. You're seeing a lot of this now where, as the third party cookies and other things are getting blocked, people have to push the analytics to the server side. So used to be, just a bit of background, used to be, anytime you would, well, depending on how they set up the website, but maybe every time you'd click on something, it would send a little packet of information over to Google that would then make its way into that company. So for example, you're running a website for your pizza place, and you want to know how many times are people clicking on your menu bar. So you would set up Google Analytics. Every time someone clicks on your menu bar, it fires a little packet of energy to Google. Google accumulates all these and sends it to you. So now if someone's using Brave or using, I think the new Safari has this, those are all blocked. So, if I'm talking to, pizzahut.com, I can't actually, my browser will actually block packets going to Google if I'm supposed to be talking to Pizza Hut. And so what that does is it forces all the analytics to have to go to the backend. So that, to use this example, every time I click on the menu, I send a little packet over to Pizza Hut, and then Pizza Hut can then pass it on to Google, or they could even do the analytics themselves. And so that's where I think we'll start to see more of a need to do, these kind of tensor operations and, calculating distributions and these other things in Ruby, in Node, in all of these different languages.
So rewind your mind back to 2004. What was the piece of software that started with web that analyzed your Apache logs and basically gave you these really great graphs of like who was accessing your website from where and all that kind of stuff? Basically, it's fascinating that we're returning to that era of things.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I can see the graph in my head. Yeah.
Yeah, I ran that for a while for my research lab.
Yeah. Anyway, on the topic of like, what is Ruby used for? I think that one of the things that you see over and over again in the apps, the kinds of programs that Ruby is really good at, is they're largely applications that are highly dynamic. And by that, I mean that they go through heavy development cycles constantly, right? That is where Ruby Ruby is supremely good at, and Rails makes it even better, right? In that same way that, like, for instance, if you were like, I need to write an app and I'm never going to change it and needs to be as fast as possible, Ruby ends up being kind of a weird use case because it's like, it's not really optimized for that kind of usage, right? And then on the flip side, right, if you want to write a little web thing and it's going to go inside, say, a Wi-Fi router, right? You might write that in C because I gotta write it one time and I needs to run in like the tiniest memory footprint possible because it's running on a little teeny MIPS chip, right? But I'm never going to change it. So it might be awful to write the first time, but I'm never going to go back to it. And so I don't really care, right? And so that spectrum of dynamism is really where you find Ruby at that far end, where you're like, hey, look, every day, like Mike can speak to this better than I can, but one of the amazing things about Ruby and Rails is the number of people that you can have that are simultaneously working on the same code base and not stepping on each other's toes. That probably is the biggest feature of Ruby. That Rails enables that, but with convention. But it is astounding. I mean, Mike, maybe you could speak to this. What is the largest team that works on a single app inside Shopify, you think?
I mean, the big monolith that we have on any given week probably has 800 contributors
To one app, to one GitHub repo.
to one GitHub repository, one Rails application. Yeah, I mean, it's hundreds of PRs a day get shipped to production.
How do you A/B test that?
We test to production. No, I'm joking. I think we really embrace the fast rollback paradigm, right? It's like we're going to be fast to ship it, and we have great observability into what's going on in production. And if something's wrong, we can roll back instantly. And so that makes the risk of failure really, really low, which means that we generally will roll forward. If something is wrong at production, we'll roll forward as often as we can. When we need to, we can back out. And we do have A/B testing frameworks, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, I think we're all developing on main. We're pushing from main, and it's managed to scale. We just have great tooling.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, that is such a, like, if I would have, someone said you got to spend money to buy a banner that basically says like why someone should use Rails, it would probably be that. It would probably be like, hey, do you want to work on the same app with 800 of your friends? This is probably what you should use, right? Because I think if you were to try to go around and evaluate that condition amongst different languages and different places, you find all of these places where stuff falls down. Oh, well, everybody has to write to this and then that, right? The fact that is, and I don't know that they necessarily meant that to happen, but the conditions allowed for it to be the case.
That makes sense. What about scalability? So I mean, clearly Rails scales because look at where it's being used. But how does that actually work? So is Rails is Rails like sitting on a thread pool, or do you spin up a bunch of copies of it on a single server? Like what's the scalability part like?
Yeah, that's all me. So one of the things I did during Rubinius was I wrote a web server for Ruby, and it was specifically to make advantage of the characteristics of Rubinius. One of the characteristics of Rubinius was it had native threads available to it that could run concurrently. And so I was like, okay, I need a web server that can really take advantage of that situation. And I coded it in a certain way that it could take advantage of it, but it used the normal API. That web server was called Puma. And that web server has sort of become the dominant Ruby web server today. And it uses techniques that come from WebRick, which is the original web server framework that's actually built into Ruby itself, techniques that come from Unicorn, which was a web server that was created in the 2007-8-esque era that still powers GitHub and kind of combines a bunch of different elements in order to give people all the right knobs that they need to do things. So what generally people do is a combination of three things. They utilize a thread pool in a single process. So it's like, okay, great. I know that my app's going to be blocked on talking to the database a good amount of the time anyway. I'm going to use a thread pool, and I'm just going to basically handle requests through a thread pool. Ruby's concurrency model is similar to Python's in that you're not going to have multiple native threads running concurrently. They're going to be blocked on I/O. They're going to switch control. But in a web app, it very rarely matters because a lot of times you're waiting on backend for processing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, let me just like dive into that a little bit for folks at home. So it sounds like there's like a global interpreter lock in Ruby, similar to Python. Yeah. So the way these languages work, imagine you have using like Python or Ruby, you have automatic garbage collection. You have all these features that are built into the language. And so it becomes really difficult if you have to handle concurrency there. So imagine you have a Python instruction that's adding a reference to an object, and you have another Python instruction that is removing that reference. If they can both run at the same time, you have race conditions, and that's just one of many examples where it becomes extremely difficult. So what most languages do is they say, you can only execute one instruction in a process at a time. Now, what happens is your instruction might say, I'm waiting for a packet to arrive over the network. And so that you want all the other threads to be blocked just because this one instruction hasn't finished yet. So certain instructions can what's called release the lock, where they can say, I'm waiting on this network packet until it arrives. Someone else can execute instructions because I know that I'm waiting for this packet and I'm not going to change the reference count on the objects, for example. And so then when this network packet arrives, then that same instruction says, now I'm awake again. Now I'm going to get the lock. I'm going to do some work with this packet. And then when I'm done with that instruction, now it'll go back to the machine to decide what instruction to run next. And so, if you and so in this way, like even though you can only execute any one instruction at a time, you can still get a ton of concurrency as long as most of the time you're releasing this lock because you're talking to a database or waiting for a network packet or something like that.
Yep, exactly right. So you have these three knobs, right? You have threads, which you can tune up and down basically how many requests you want an individual process to handle at the same time, basically locking and unlocking. Then you have workers, which is effectively how many processes you want, right? It's going to use Unix forking in order to basically say, like, I needed more of these things. And then all of those things aren't going to share memory, so they can run truly concurrent. They can share the same socket, so they can handle different things. Uses the same technique that the Apache web server came up with back in time memoriam, right? Of like, I'm going to just have multiple processes listening on the same socket on the Unix side, right? And so basically what I tell people is you just sit there and you just tune those knobs, right? You say like, okay, great. Like I want to hit a certain request per second. Okay, I'm going to turn up the threads. At a certain point, turning up the threads will actually hurt your request per second because you'll basically be handling, you'll be accepting more requests than you can actually handle in your throughput for how quickly you can get around to threads. So then that was too many. Let me turn it back down. Then we turn the workers up a little bit because every time you turn workers up, you increase your memory footprint, right? So you just turn those two knobs and eventually you find a sweet spot that's for your app. And once you find that sweet spot, then you say like, okay, great. Wherever you're running, your container engine, your VMs, whatever, you say like, okay, great. That's our multiplier, or that's our fixed number of requests per second. Now I want to multiply it. And then you just apply a multiplier of instances. You say like, okay, we got 1,000. We need to hit 1,000 requests per second, and one of our tuning can hit 100 requests per second. Let's just say. So now I need 10 of those things. Great. Let me just fire up 10 of them, and you're done. You go to lunch.
Yeah, is having multiple processes, how does that compare to running multiple pods in Kubernetes, right? So in Kubernetes, you can say, I want 4 pods, and you might get all 4 pods on the same machine. Is that like, what efficiency loss is there between that and just running 4 processes?
So there is an efficiency. It's not as significant, but the reason that it exists to do it natively is to take advantage of a functionality that's built into Unix operating systems, which is what people mostly deploy on, called copy on write memory. So what you will do is you'll load your app in, right? Let's just say you have a fairly big app and it's going to load the whole app into memory. It's going to parse it, load all the objects, do all the initialization, and let's say that your footprint is 150 megabytes, right? So you loaded all that stuff in, it was 150 megabytes. So you load it into one process, and then what you do is you fork that process. So basically you make a clone of it. And what happens when you make a clone of it is that clone has its own memory. It's never gonna touch the parent. But what Unix systems do is they actually they delay performing the copy until the latest possible time. So if I can still read memory and it reads from the parent, and if I write to it, it will copy it. That's the copy on write. And so what happens is that if you do that, what you get is memory efficiency by using that sort of worker model where you can fork, because you will get this shared sort of memory pool that comes from the original start, and that the memory that's used by the individual worker processes will just be the memory that's required to process each individual request. So you can achieve some memory savings. And again, it kind of depends on the size of your application, what you're doing a little bit with it, that kind of thing. So
it might also be worth mentioning here, I'll give a shout out to my colleague, Jean Boussier, who has recently proposed in Ruby to have an API call that says, now we are ready to do that copy on write, to fork a new process to do the copy on write thing, so that the Ruby VM is now being optimized for the web context that it's running in for Rails. which is really interesting. It's like Rails requirements making its way into Ruby. But the idea is that Ruby does as much upfront as it possibly can, and then you signal, okay, now I'm ready to fork, so that as much memory as possible won't be written to afterwards. Like that mechanism that Evan just explained, we're going to defer more and more and more of that writing, or try to do it upfront if we can.
Yeah, that makes sense. I saw this really compelling. I think it was a blog or a tutorial where someone was using ZFS, which has copy on write as well, and so what they were able to do is basically take their I think it was their family photos, or it was something that was really large, like gigabytes and gigabytes, and basically copy it every day so they could have a snapshot. And so even though you look at this, you say, oh, there's a cron job that's doing, CP directory, and this directory is 20 gig and it's doing it every day. Oh my God, this can't possibly be sustainable. But under the hood, ZFS is smart enough to say, oh, just keep references here. And if someone changes a file, now actually just transparently make the copy. And so, yeah, Fork does something similar for memory. I've gotten burned by Fork in the past. I don't remember exactly what it was, but there was something with it had to do with CUDA and the GPU. So when you start getting into GPU memory and some of these things, you have to be careful. I know Torch now switched to using Spawn instead of Fork, which does make like a complete copy, a deep copy of everything. But yeah, if you're not doing crazy GPU stuff, Fork is more than adequate.
Yeah, I think that there are so many foot guns around Fork specifically, because one of the other big
word, foot gun.
Yeah, one of the other specific ones, and this is probably what you hit, is that the semantics of Fork are, let's see, it's 2022 now. So the semantics of Fork are 50 years old now or so. And so there's all these efficiencies that were built into Fork that aren't useful anymore, but we still pay for. Pay for in the quantity of foot guns that are available to you on a daily basis. And so like the resources, so for instance, file descriptors are shared between two processes, right? So if you open a file and you fork, that other thing still has access to the same file. Yeah, that's cool. That's maybe useful. It can be very useful. It is so problematic if you don't know that it's happening in certain cases, right? Because two processes are advancing the file, the file at the same time, and only getting parts of it and all kinds of crazy stuff. Things like semaphores and all kinds of OS related handles are copied. They're not copied, they're shared between those two. It's really just memory for the most part that is a copy. Everything else ends up being this share. And I think Spawn lets you say, I want like a whole fresh new coat of paint here. Don't share any. I don't want the same cup holders as the old one. I don't want the same gas pedal as the same. I want all new stuff. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so this is a perfect time to just remind people, if you don't want to have to learn the hard way about fork versus spawn and spend days on it like we have, use Ruby on Rails. Like, don't build your own web service. That's just one rabbit hole you'll end up having to go down. And actually, if you're really interested in that level of detail, that's great. I mean, you can work on making any one of these frameworks a lot better. But chances are you'll want to at least start by doing something high level and using something like Rails. Let's jump a little bit into what you all have kind of been up to and how folks can kind of contribute and be a part of this. So I think if someone is super enthusiastic about Rails, it sounds like Shopify and RubyCentral are both kind of places where they can go to and contribute and learn more about. Why don't you maybe talk about what are sort of the opportunities out there for folks maybe who are just graduating college, or maybe they're still in college?
Sure. Well, I think that the first thing I would say is there are indeed Ruby and Rails jobs out there. They're in demand and they pay well. So number one, if you're interested in doing Ruby, right, you can always reach out to Shopify or a number of other Ruby shops, which is great. There's my plug for Shopify hiring.
What is the state with remote, and is it sort of US? Is it global?
Shopify is hiring globally right now. So we post pandemic, moved into a post-office world. We don't have offices anymore. Everyone is fully remote. That was a big step change for Shopify, because Shopify had kind of built its identity around in-person offices with great perks, right? Where people could go after work and go to 3D print something or play ping pong, or have a great lunch with their colleagues. And that in-person experience is just not available anymore. But the flip side of that is that we can now hire amazing people anywhere they are in the world. And so teams generally find a few time zones that they are affiliated with, right? So like maybe a team chooses to be mainly East Coast US, but also work a little bit earlier to handle European colleagues, or vice versa. They're on the West Coast and maybe they shift a little bit later to have some Pac Rim colleagues in Japan or Australia. And so it's a really, really flexible place to work. And if you're interested at all, please reach out.
What about internships? Are there internship opportunities for people who are still students?
Yes, absolutely. So we have internships, of course. And I think we also have a really great program called the Dev Degree Internship, which is for folks who are in college and need co-op opportunities. They can actually spend a few years alternating between a semester at school and a semester working at Shopify on a real team. And I think the conversion rate of that program has been huge. Like a lot of really talented folks have stuck around and taken full-time jobs afterwards. And that's a great opportunity as well. It's called the Dev Degree Program.
Cool. That makes sense. Just out of curiosity, Shopify, I believe it was in Canada. Is that right? Before the remote thing?
It is a Canadian company at its heart. Yes, everyone is super nice, just like all Canadians are. Shopify was founded, and the main headquarters has always been in Ottawa.
Got it.
Ottawa is not exactly a gigantic metropolis. It's kind of I would call it like maybe a second tier city. It's not a New York or Chicago or an LA, but Shopify built this reputation as being the best tech employer in Ottawa, and that fueled a lot of its growth for about a decade.
Wow, that is wild. So is it kind of like totally remote now, in the sense like the lease is disbanded and there isn't an office? Or
So I think we still have some real estate in a few offices, but we use that for like team offsites. Essentially, we use the verb burst for it because the teams come together and they like burst in happiness and productivity. But they're mainly used as like co-working sites where teams come together for 3 or 4 days to maybe finish a project, shape up style. And there's nobody going into that office every day for work anymore.
That is wild. So the the things you talked about, the 3D printing and the perks, all of that. What have you found to be sort of the best substitute for that now that everything is distributed?
I mean, I think it's definitely challenging. I think a lot of folks who found they really need like that work, so the social aspect of being physically together at work, to be missing. And so Shopify has done a bunch of things, I think, to try to address this. Like we do a lot of social events, so teams get together. Like my team has like a show and tell or a social thing on a Tuesday afternoon. We do coffee on Friday afternoon. We have a couple of other events that we do. And that at least gives us an opportunity to kind of get together and just chat and be social, which is great. We try to get together as often as we can, like at least a few times a year. Most teams will get together in person at these like offsites. Shopify also has really great perks for at home. Like I think new employees will get a budget to build out a home office so that they're comfortable, at least if they can't have an office to commit to, they can be comfortable at home. And I think that it's a trade-off though, right? So folks who really like, I find a lot of folks who are right out of college, their social lives become the network of people that they know from work. Like I know I did this, right? Like I married my wife who I met at work at my first job, right? I think that it's a choice that everybody has to make for themselves, whether they want to be in person now that we're kind of like, I don't want to say we're past the pandemic because I don't think that's true. But a lot of places have their offices open again. And I think that's a choice everybody needs to make for themselves. But I've been super happy at Shopify. Like, I really love it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when folks do get together in person, that's got to be a fascinating thing. I mean, I remember I recently went to a new job. I took a new job about a year ago and we're in person. But before that, there were people who I had brought on to the team maybe 2 years prior. And even 2 years later, I'd never met them in person. And so, getting together, it's really interesting. You kind of have to say, well, here's here's the nonverbal side of me. Here's like the part of me like outside of the rectangle of the Zoom call, right? And then also at the same time, maybe we could do something productive while we're here.
Yeah, for my day job, I work for HashiCorp, which we haven't talked about here because it's not really Ruby related, but we do the same thing. And I was just going to say, whenever we're also fully remote and have been for quite some time, one of the things I always have to tell people is, by the way, I'm 6'4", just so you know, because you can't tell Zoom at all. And so the first time people meet me, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. I was like, I know, it's because my head is well proportioned to my shoulders. So there's no way you could tell on Zoom that I'm this tall. Like, and we make this joke every single time. And yet every single time I meet people in person for the first time, they're like, you weren't kidding. And I was like, no, I was not. So
I have the same thing where I think part of it too is my camera. I don't use my laptop camera because just the way my desk is set up, I would be like heavily backlit. It would look like I'm in a witness protection program or something. So I got a camera and it just happens to have a pretty wide lens. So my head and my body just look small because there's so much other room. And then people meet me and I'm 6'2", and they're like, "Oh my God, you're so tall." Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Cool. So, I assume that you can go to shopify.com/careers or /jobs. We'll put the right link up in the show notes for folks. So if you're listening at home, go to the show notes. Almost any podcast app has a little notes section, and so we'll put a link in there. You can just click straight in.
Cool. I didn't mean to turn that into a whole like employment pitch for Shopify, but I really do love working.
No, it's cool. I'm a big fan of following Shopify. There was a really interesting blog post that the CEO of Shopify made. I'll have to go back and find it, but it really struck me. It had to do with, so basically, Shopify is like a true marketplace. The person was saying, if you look at YouTube is sort of has this like content farms where they're creating all of this content, but then the content creators are not really connected to the ad system. The ad system is really the centralized YouTube thing. And so it's almost like there are kickbacks, but it's completely up to YouTube, versus Shopify is like truly a marketplace that's like sort of building up, as you said, a lot of small businesses, which is really nice to see.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think the store owners own their own brand. They have their own domain. Like maybe like the flip side of that would be like Amazon, where if you have something to sell, people are still going to Amazon.com and searching, and then like Amazon gets to show competitors up against your your thing too. And for us, it really is about putting the merchant front and center, allowing them to build their brand, allowing them to build an audience or customers that come back over and over again, and they own that asset, right? It happens to run on Shopify's Rails app on our hardware, but they actually own that storefront themselves, and all the information about their customers they own and not Shopify.
Yeah, I happened to be looking for an e-bike for my wife, and I was on the Aventon.com. They sell e-bikes, and it actually is a Shopify site. And the reason why I started going directly to these companies was something kind of, sometimes something small happens, but ends up kind of leaving a big impact. And for me, I typed in Duracell batteries, and I got Amazon Basics batteries as the first choice. And for some reason, that had a really big impact on me. I was thinking, wow, I'm probably missing out on like actually the best product here, So yeah, I think it's an amazing platform. It's really cool stuff. If you're looking out there for internships, jobs, definitely a good place to go. And there's no physical limitation there. So you could be out in Idaho, you could be anywhere, and you should definitely reach out. What about you, Evan? Like, are there folks, you have hiring opportunities either at HashiCorp or through RubyCentral?
Yeah, I mean, RubyCentral, I think, is really small. I think that there's not a lot of positions. And I resigned as a director there a couple months ago, so I don't have the latest either. But one of the things that I know that RubyCentral is doing right now is working with the the RubyShield program with Shopify to take some of to use the money, the funds that have become available to hire people. So like one of the things that we're looking to do is hire people who are interested in Ruby gems and that sort of thing. And I think that effort is starting up. And I guess if someone out there listening is like, you know what, I have this really great proposal to improve this, that, and the other thing. I'll figure out a link in the show note to shoot over to that for that. At HashiCorp specifically, yeah, I mean, we've been all remote since the inception, so almost a decade now. The co-founders were remote from each other, or have been remote from each other for 8 of those 10 years or so. So we have HashiCorp.com/jobs, I believe, working on all kinds of different things. A number of Ruby jobs as well.
Cool. Yeah, I've used, I think Terraform and Vault are both HashiCorp projects. Yeah, I didn't realize there was a big Ruby footprint there.
Yeah, Terraform Cloud, which is our Terraform app, SaaS offering, is all written in Rails.
Wow, did not know that. That is well. Actually, this is a bit curious. If you are going to a website, is there a telltale sign that this was written in Rails? Is there something that kind of gives it away? Like, I'm trying to think, like maybe with the developer tools.
Not as much anymore. As everybody has moved to RESTful routes, it's harder to tell. You could probably look at maybe some of the headers to try to figure out like, oh, this looks like the pattern that is injected by this asset management framework that's available in Rails, but that's pretty minor because everybody has sort of copied the same techniques over time. So not as much anymore. Yeah, no, people stopped putting the old powered by PHP buttons on the bottom in the footers. You know, maybe we should bring that back. Mike, what do you think?
I'm all for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love those. I love the powered by, Linux, powered by PHP little buttons that people would put down there. So that was in the days pre, like what we were talking about at the top of the show, of pre-cookies, cookie tracking and all that kind of thing. Those images would go into someone's log so they could find out how many people hit this thing, so I could figure out how many people are actually on this website. So,
Yep. Very cool. Actually, just kind of a random question, and then we can close it out. But you talked about REST APIs. Is there a connection between Rails and Open API or Swagger or these other things? Is there a way to generate that? Is that a thing? Or like, I guess maybe the higher level question is, are people using Rails for API servers, or is it really just mostly for front end web servers?
100%. People are definitely using Rails as both a full stack website, but also just an API server. Like 100%. In fact, I think there's actually an option you can pass to the Rails new command, which is like a -- API. And what it'll do is it'll just optimize that installation for like a headless API only version of Rails. Shopify's big monolith is primarily a GraphQL API server for the most part, right? Because we do a lot of React on the front end. And so the React is just hitting GraphQL APIs or REST APIs on the back end. And you find like that's where all the complicated business logic is anyway. It's not easier just because you're not having to render views, right? But yeah, absolutely. Rails is fantastic as an API server.
Cool. That's awesome. Well, I want to give both of you some time to just kind of close it out. If there's tons of folks out there, a lot, of students out there who are just getting started. And what kind of advice would you give them? Maybe, Mike, I'll start with you.
Stay curious. I guess that would be my advice. Is every I think looking back on a 25-year career, all the really fun things I did were because I noticed something that was like broken or wasn't quite right, and I was like, why is that doing that? And then like you do the deep dive and you learn a little bit about your tools and you learn how things break, which teaches you how they're supposed to work, which makes you a better engineer. And usually you get like a great cocktail party story out of it at the end of it all too, where you go, you're not going to believe what I found at work today. And you just stay curious. And as long as you're doing that, I think that's the best advice I can give anyone.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that and push it even more. I've talked about this with other people before, but like I'm not generally a life planner, right? Like I didn't plan out a career. I didn't plan out most of anything. Vacations is basically what I plan out. That's about it.
Nice.
But I feel like I've been very lucky. And looking back on my luck over time, I feel like it's one of those elements where I mostly just took the thing that was most interesting, that really, I trusted my gut about the thing that was most interesting to just go and say, like, I'm going to do that next. That's the thing I'm going to do next, right? I'm interested in it. So I had to have interest. So again, to Mike's point, like, be curious, like, like if you think that this sounds interesting, like just do a little research, look it up, try different things, right? I think that you will be amazed at how those things, more so than even a cocktail party, you'd be amazed at like, oh, I looked at this thing and now it's perfectly applicable to what I'm doing every day. Or you're in an interview and you may say like, do you have an interesting story? And you tell them the story and be like, that's amazing. I had the same problem. Like the tech community is amazingly small, but amazingly wide in terms of breadth, right? So like, if you had some weird little thing that you did, you might find that somebody else had that same thing, and that might be your in to have a conversation with them about a job. Or if you are really interested in this thing that maybe you can't figure out how to do right now, you might just continue to cultivate that and find out that later on, now there's that thing sort of appears. It might feel like luck, but really it's you making your own luck.
Yeah, really, really well said. You might even get to the point where you've only done machine learning. You can still talk about fork and spawn and how painful they are.
Exactly.
Somebody who's done Ruby.
Yeah.
It's amazing. A real treasure and a pleasure having you both on the show. I really appreciate it. Absolutely fascinating interview. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah.
Cool. And thank you folks out there for listening, supporting us on Patreon. It's getting close to the holiday episode. I mean, it's by the time this goes out, it'll probably be about 2 months away, maybe 6 weeks. But Patrick and I are already planning a pretty awesome holiday episode and at the end of the year to kind of round it out. Thanks again for supporting us on Audible and sending us emails. We really appreciate all of the feedback that we get. Thanks a lot, guys. See you later.
Music by Eric Barndollar.
Programming Throwdown is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike 2.0 license. You're free to share, copy, distribute, transmit the work, to remix, adapt the work, but you must provide attribution to Patrick and I, and share alike in kind.